important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video would like to start with the most important piece of news. So we are going to talk about Ukrainian refusal to accept the bodies. The exchange of the prisoners and bodies between Russia and Ukraine has been postponed until next week. Preparations for the exchange are still underway. We are talking about the seriously ill and seriously wounded young people, as well as the return of the bodies of the dead. So according to information we have, the Russians were planning to return to Ukraine 6,000 bodies. But for some reason, the Ukrainians decided not to accept the bodies, and they decided to postpone the situation for the next week. The Russians, of course, made their own statement regarding this situation, regarding this refusal. The Kiev regime does not need its citizens either alive or dead, said Maria Zakharova, commenting to TASS on Kiev's refusal to accept the bodies of the soldiers and the postponement of the prisoners exchange. You know that this is a very important situation, because I would like to remind you that if Ukrainians accepted the bodies of 6,000 soldiers, then they would be forced, the Kiev authorities would be forced to pay their citizens, to the relatives and the parents, and probably to wives and mothers and fathers of these dead soldiers around $2 billion, and Ukraine currently doesn't have this money. So this is the one important thing. Another important thing, that now we start receiving lots of updates from the soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine on the ground, that they began refusing orders of Ukrainian commanders, because now they see and they understand, even if they go, let's say, and start another offensive operation on the Russian positions, and even if they died, most likely the Ukrainian authorities would not return their bodies and would not pay their families money until at least the end of the special military operation. And we're talking about billions of dollars that Ukraine doesn't have right now. Another important thing, another important statistic we got from Ukrainian journalist Vladimir Boyko. So let's discuss this article, the scale of desertion in the armed forces of Ukraine, according to Ukrainian journalist Vladimir Boyko. As Boyko writes, in the first 5 months of 2025, more than 90,000 criminal proceedings were registered under Articles 407 and 408 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, which relates to unauthorized abandonment of the unit. So in total, since the beginning of the special military operation as of June 1st of 2025, around 213,000 cases of desertion have already been registered. So as you can see, just during the 5 months of 2025, Ukraine registered around 50% of the total cases of desertion, which means that the situation is very difficult. Probably the reason of this situation, one of the reasons of this situation, is also not the accepting of the bodies and complete refusal of payments of money to the parents and relatives of dead Ukrainian soldiers. So now let's return back to the ground, and let's start with the situation in the Sumy direction. And it's also very important to know that the units of the 33rd Assault Regiment, the units and the soldiers of 225th Assault Regiment and 425th Separate Assault Regiment began refusing orders of the Ukrainian commanders to continue offensives in this direction. And one of the reasons they are saying is that Ukrainians are not going to return their dead bodies and to pay their relatives money. So we have some, not just something like we can speculate, we start receiving first real facts from the situation on the ground. Anyway, according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians managed to improve their positions on the eastern flank of the city of Tyotkina and in the southwestern direction. According to information we have, the Ukrainians took under control farms in the southeastern part and several buildings to the east of the railways. Let's compare the situation between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 7th of June of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of 8th of June. So as you can see, the Ukrainians haven't managed to establish control over the settlement of Tyotkina probably since the beginning of the battle that started 2 months ago. At the same time, during probably 3 times less period of time, the Russians took under control a lot of villages in the direction of the city of Sumy, and today, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continued this process. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to enter the southwestern part of the settlement by the name of Mala Karchakovka. And when talking about this village, this is already the second defense layer of the armored forces of Ukraine in the Sumy direction. This is very important. The Russians began clashes for the second defense layer. Another important thing is that today pro-Ukrainian sources confirmed that the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Loknya. Furthermore, when talking about the adjustments on the map that were provided by pro-Ukrainian sources, they show that the Russians control around 30% of the settlement of Yunakivka, which means that the battle for this territory will be finished also in the very near future. Furthermore, we got reports that the Russians secured several forests in the area of the village of Yunakivka, between the village of Yunakivka and the border of the Russian Federation. We're talking about this huge forest and this one. So let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation that you can see in front of your screen, is the situation by the end of the 7th of February. As you can see, just yesterday the Russians secured this forest, and today we got updates that this forest was taken by the Russians as well.
I dag, der skal ud og køre i den her folkevogn ID3.
Volkswagen ID3 er en familiebil i mellemklassen.
I'm not sure whether the Russians are going to move as deep as possible, let's say through this huge forest, Sumy forest, in the direction of the city of Sumy itself, but obviously the Russians will try to take this small forest under complete control. Anyway, the Ukrainians have already announced that the population of the city of Sumy should consider evacuation to safer regions. Former Speaker of the General Staff of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, Seleznyov, which means that the Russians most likely will try to take the city of Sumy under complete control. Everything just depends on whether the Russians are able to move fast and without huge losses. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupinsk direction. Today, several mappers adjusted their maps in the vicinity of the villages of Radkovka and Kondrashovka. Neutral mappers reported that Ukrainians during the previous days either managed to counterattack Russian positions in Radkovka and in the village of Kondrashovka from the southern direction, or the Russians at the beginning of their offensive didn't take these territories under control. So we have adjusted and colored these territories as a contested area, but I would like to remind you that during the previous weeks the Russians reported, and we got several geolocations and confirmations with the Russian flags, that the settlement of Kondrashovka was taken by the Russians and that the village of Radkovka was taken by the Russians as well. So anyway, as for now, we are going to adjust the map as a contested area until we get additional geolocations and additional proofs either of Russian or Ukrainian control. Now let's talk about the southern Kupinsk direction, or the Liman direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, the Russians managed to answer the village of Grekovka from the south. This information was confirmed and provided by pro-Russian and neutral resources. So the Russians were attacking using these routes of attack, and that the first buildings of Grekovka is already under complete Russian control. So this is very important offensive, but we don't think that the Russians are going to intensify their activities in this direction. Probably they just want to maintain the lines and to get another village where they can concentrate units. At the same time, the Russians are attacking in the direction of the city of Liman. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 12 hours managed to improve their positions along the river of Nitrius by taking under control additional territories of the armored forces of Ukraine under complete control, additional tree lines, and the Russians managed to improve their positions around the village of Zelena Dolina. Basically, when talking about the village of Zelena Dolina, the Russians tightened the news around the settlement once again. Currently, the Ukrainians are caught in cauldron in this area, and this information was confirmed not just by pro-Russian neutral mappers. The critical situation with the Ukrainians in the village of Zelena Dolina was also confirmed by pro-Ukrainian sources. Obviously, the situation is very critical. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinovka direction. The most important updates are coming from the settlement of Yablunovka, so from the Kliban-Bykskaya direction. Today, pro-Russian resources and pro-Ukrainian resources confirmed that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to finish the battle for the most western part of the settlement of Yablunovka. So the western part of the village of Yablunovka was taken by the Russians today on the 6th of on the 8th of June of 2025. The battle for the central part of the village of Yablunovka begins. When talking about the central part, this is exactly the area we're talking about. So now the Russians will try to take this territory under complete control, and if the Russians are able to force Ukrainians to fall back from this territory, then the battle for the eastern part of Yablunovka will begin. And when talking about the eastern part, this is exactly the territory we're talking about. With the fall of the eastern part of Yablunovka, the Russians most likely would be able to create a cauldron for the armed forces of Ukraine that are currently located in the villages of Novospaska, Sherbinovka, Katerinovka, and Kliban-Byk. So the situation in this area remains tense, and Ukrainians will see can't stabilize the situation. Now let's talk about the N32 roads and the Russian additional attempts to move in the northwestern direction with the purpose to outflank the Pokrovsk agglomeration. According to information we have, during the previous 24-48 hours, the Russians destroyed one of the most important bridges in this area between the Pokrovsk agglomeration and the settlement of Drushkovka that is located in the Konstantinovka direction. In this video we can see the consequences of Russian attack. Most likely the Russians used either missile or FAB, and as a result of this attack, the bridge was completely destroyed. Now Ukrainians are no longer available to use this bridge for supply and support and for their logistic purposes. Obviously, Ukraine logistic hasn't collapsed as a result of this attack. Obviously, they will be able to find a solution, but obviously, Ukrainian capabilities, logistic capabilities reduced for probably several percent. Now let's talk about the South Donetsk direction. The Russians continue their offensive operation. The most interesting updates are coming from the settlement of Alexeyevka. According to information we have, during the previous 20 to 48 hours, the Russians managed to establish control for around 33% of the settlement. So let's compare the maps between the dates, and this is the situation on the ground by the end of the 6th of June of 2025, right before the beginning of Russian offensive operation. By the end of the 7th of June of 2025, the Russians managed to secure the southeastern part of the village of Alexeyevka. We came to this based on the video that was published by the 46th Brigade of the Armored Forces of Ukraine. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in the eastern part of the settlement. By the end of the 8th of June we got reports that the Russians secured the northeastern part and the farms in the most northeastern direction. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers. So as the same situation as in the village of Yablunovka, the Russians secured around 33% of the settlement, and the Russians entered the central part of the settlement itself. There are very heavy clashes. Furthermore, the Russians continue improving their positions in the southeastern part of Kamar. There are very heavy clashes. The Russians currently are focused on taking under complete control over the territories, over the farms that located in the southeastern direction. At least this information was provided by neutral mappers. Once again, the Russians are trying and are planning to take under complete control these farms and these companies stronghold in the southeastern part of the settlement. This will allow the Russians to increase their positions around southeastern part of the settlement of Kamar. Now let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction. The Russians indeed launched their offensive operation. The most interesting updates are coming from the Gulay-Polye direction. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours improved their positions, and they started improving their positions 48 hours ago. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 6th of June. This is the situation by the end of the 7th of June. The Russians secured several tree lines, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 8th of June. So according to these updates, we see that the Russians are trying to outflank the settlement of Malinovka from the east and from the northeast, and most likely the Russians will try to attack between the settlements of Poltava and Malinovka with the purpose to cut this territory in two. At the same time, we expect that the Russians are about to begin another offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Uspenovka using this road of attack. This will allow the Russians in the end, all in all, to encircle the settlement of Gulay-Polye, and obviously this encirclement could take place somewhere in July or August of 2025. Additional reports we got from the area of Orekhov. Today, several pro-Russian resources and neutral mappers confirmed that the Russians improved their positions to the south of the settlement of Novodanilovka. Most likely, the Russians have begun their offensive operation in the direction of Orekhov, and currently the Russians are bombing the settlement of Mala-Takmachka with FABs. Something big is brewing here. Most likely, the Russians are not going to stop. They will continue, obviously, until they get the city of Orekhov itself. So the situation, as we can see, is very difficult for the Ukrainians. The Russians are attacking along the entire line of combat contact. We see that Ukrainians refuse to accept the bodies which lead to desertion. We see that just during the 2025, around 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers left positions in their units, and we see collapse not of defense, we see the collapse of the entire Ukrainian army. And that's it for the short video. Military summary channel reminds we can